There is a darkness in humanity that has manifested itself in a lust for blood throughout the ages. The Old Testament and ancient myths catalog murder and revenge as part of the fabric of life in ancient times. Cain slew Abel. Romulus slew Remus. Unleashing the beast within is a possibility for all of us. The decision to kill from passion or premeditation has often defined our world, past, present, and future. Wars have terrorized entire populations for thousands of years. The American West was home to ruthless killers who were idolized in fiction and folklore. Evil evolved to a hideous new form with the genocidal dictators of the 20th century, such as Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong, who ordered the death of tens of millions. But in the middle of the 20th century, a new and chilling phenomenon emerged in post-war Western society: the serial killer. As if fashioned from our nightmares, they terrify and fascinate us. Lurking behind masks of bland normality, they often evade capture for years, decades, or eternity. They are America's serial killers.
We killed her. We dumped her body off, and that was it. Nothing to it.
Every year in this country, we have about 20 serial killers, 10 of whom are apprehended, 10 of whom are on the loose. And they are, in total, responsible for some 200 deaths. So 200 victims of serial killers on a yearly basis. And what makes this particularly important for us is that the average serial killer is responsible for 10 deaths. That's a huge body count.
America's Serial Killers, Portraits in Evil, will strip the covers from a world of profiling and forensic science as we expose America's most brutal serial killers.
You know, the 1960s and 70s represented the dawn of a new era of serial murder in this country. And we saw the Boston Strangler in 62 through 64. The Zodiac was operating from 1969 on. Charles Manson in the late 1960s. And people were not used to thinking about these kinds of crimes because they hardly ever occurred. And then all of a sudden, we saw this tremendous increase in serial killings around the country. And it continued for several decades, so that many people were terrified wherever they lived, because even if there was no serial killer on the loose, they suspected that there was.
In 1963, the decade of the 60s, the decade of the new frontier, the decade of hope and promise, was shattered irreparably with the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. America was about to become a killing field. The 1960s were about to become the decade of death. As an unpopular war raged in Vietnam, television and newspapers reported daily body counts in the hundreds from both sides as headline news. When black civil rights activists confronted the old racist forces of the South, they were met with murder. In 1964, 3 civil rights activists, Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, were murdered. By 1965, America exploded in rage, and for 2 years, violent clashes arose on American streets as inner cities became scenes of brutality and horror. From Watts to Detroit, hundreds died. All of it shown nightly on the news. On July 14, 1966, Richard Speck introduced television audiences to a new deadly phenomena, the murder spree, when he brutally and systematically killed 8 student nurses from South Chicago Community Hospital. And nowhere more poignantly than when Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy became the next victims of assassination. The decade of death ended in tragedy in 1970, when the flower power and peace visions of the hippies turned deadly, and 4 students were killed by National Guardsmen at Kent State University. But the American penchant for murder found a whole new facet in the late 60s, thanks largely to an ex-convict and sometime musician from California. No one personified the dark side of the 60s clash of values more than the sex and drug-crazed demon hippie, Charles Manson. He added a new element to the overall violence of the period and opened the floodgates to a new wave of serial killing. Manson's perversion of life included an apocalyptic race war he named Helter Skelter, after the Beatles' hit song by the same name. The race war never materialized. Instead, the demented Manson and his equally demented family launched America onto the path of a serial killing spree that would last for decades.
Well, Manson certainly got people interested in crime and homicide. They got interested because of the semi-celebrities that were killed. I'd say semi because they weren't that well known yet. I think they were on their way to becoming well known. And the way the media treated some of the crime scenes that the sheriff's department allowed them to. The media basically walked all over the law enforcement community during part of that case, and they got a lot of information they shouldn't have had. And a lot of that information came out in the press and in television. Consequently, it just generated more interest on the part of the public. And it's almost as if that was the start of an era of serial killers as well as mass killing done all at one time.
Manson was born in 1934 to a 16-year-old unwed mother, Kathleen Maddox. Named Charles Miles Maddox, he took the name of Manson from a man his mother later married. From the start, Manson's life was a litany of brutality. At age 5, his mother, an alcoholic, sold him to a woman for a pitcher of beer. As a young boy, Manson turned to crime and was in and out of juvenile centers, even escaping from Boys Town in Nebraska. By 1967, when he began to form his infamous family, he had spent half of his 32 years in jails and prisons. 1967 was the summer of love, and Manson set himself up as a self-styled guru in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury, America's center of the counterculture. He attracted followers, mostly women. Together, his family traveled the western U.S. in a hippie-styled VW van, ending up in Los Angeles. Manson controlled his family, loving the sense of power over other human beings. On August 8, 1969, that sense of power turned deadly with the brutal assault at actress Sharon Tate's home. Manson sent members of his family to kill everyone at the house. The victims, Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, her friend Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, and her lover were butchered, slashed, and stabbed as many as 51 times. When the Manson family members left, they wrote the word "pig" on the front door in Sharon Tate's blood. 2 nights later, the family struck again. This time, led by Manson, they entered the home of Leno LaBianca and his wife, Rosemary. While Manson watched, the family members used knives to hack their helpless victims to death. The word "war" was carved into Leno LaBianca's stomach, while the couple's blood was used to write the words "rise," "death to pigs," and "helter skelter" on the walls of their home. When the Manson family was finally brought to justice, their horrific acts defied understanding. Yet, at the same time, they fascinated the public. And the cause of the killings was hotly debated. Some felt it was a political statement. Others do not agree.
There are also times when I think there's a political element to this. When someone is angry at a particular group, it could be people who are gay, people who are of color, people who are Jewish. And so there's this preoccupation with kind of snuffing out not just these individuals, but this group of people that these individuals happen to represent. And they are so obsessed by this particular group that there's no sense of guilt or remorse. They feel as if they're accomplishing an important mission.
I'm not sure the degree to which I buy into how much Charles Manson really believed in helter-skelter and the creation of a race war. For example, if you're going to create a race war by killing white people, don't you write things on the walls like, "Die white motherfuckers" or something like that? And they did not do that. These were people who death became part of their day-to-day vibe. Charles Manson liked creating an atmosphere of fear and of that kind of consciousness that fear brings. And certainly the killing of people and killing of the people that they disagreed with, the pigs, so to speak, became common talk around their family and around their group until it became actualized.
At age 73, Charles Manson remains in prison, not even bothering to show up to his parole hearings. This demonic figure is still what he always was: a little man who needed murder to feel big. With the changing American consciousness, California in the late 60s and 70s was indeed the center of hippiedom, the center of everything new and exciting. So it is not surprising that this state that produced everything new would also produce a new breed of serial killer. A unique serial killer. A serial killer that would come out of Northern California's Bay Area. He was a night predator who killed not with his bare hands, but with a gun. This terrifying serial killer would be given the nickname the Zodiac Killer.
Everybody who becomes interested in the subject of serial killers sort of finds one or another that fascinates them maybe the most. And I think for me, it's got to be the Zodiac Killer. I think the fact that he wasn't apprehended obviously plays into it. But I think even more than that, the letters to the police, how the distance that he had. It was obvious with Zodiac that killing was his aim. He killed people in cars, he killed couples. He obviously had something against young couples, and there's some psychology, I'm sure. There's some psychology of the Zodiac, I'm sure, that plays into that. But also the outfit, right? On that one murder that he committed by that lake near San Francisco, one of the victims survived to tell the tale of this bizarre outfit that he wore with like a squared off bag on his head and the Zodiac symbol on his chest. That to me adds a level of fascination to the crime, simply because this is a person whose fantasy life was being led to such an extreme degree that they actually produced a uniform for themselves. That's unique.
Since the Zodiac Killer was never caught, there are no pictures, no childhood stories to analyze, only handwritten letters and postcards and his infamous Zodiac costume. Many have called him the perfect serial killer. The first to die was a teenage couple, David Faraday, 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, 16, shot dead on December 20th, 1968. They were followed 6 months later with another shooting. Michael McGough, 19, and Darlene Ferrin, 22. Darlene was killed with 9 bullets from a 9mm pistol pumped into her body. The young man, shot 4 times, survived. Now the Zodiac called the police and said, "You will find the kids in a brown car. I shot them with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye." Clearly, the Zodiac loved killing. The power of controlling life and death. A power that he would extend to manipulating and terrifying a whole community through the media. No doubt, the Zodiac had seen how television, in its own twisted way, glorified the killings by the Manson family. He was becoming the first serial killer to kill for killing's sake. Then he skillfully used the press to exalt his supposed godlike power.
If they can't torture, they can at least play a cat and mouse game with the police, taunting them with cryptic clues, feeling superior to law enforcement. That too gives them a sense of power. And finally, if everything else fails, they can at least terrify the community and become big shot celebrities, making the front page, the headlines, the 11 o'clock news. Everybody knows who they are now, even if it's only anonymously. They have determined our agenda, and that makes them feel really good about themselves.
Now the killer began sending a series of chilling communications to the press, each signed with the astrological symbol of the Zodiac. The letters were encoded and contained a line of cipher, decoded by 2 local high school teachers. The message read, "I will be reborn in paradise, and all those I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name, because you'll try to slow or stop my collecting slaves for my afterlife." Panic spread throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. The Zodiac, as he was now called, would kill again on September 29, 1969. On that fateful afternoon, college students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were relaxing along the shore of a Napa Valley lake. According to Brian, Cecilia noticed a man lingering in the shade of some trees nearby. Suddenly, he appeared wearing a black hood with eye slits and the Zodiac symbol painted on it. The assailant held the frightened students at gunpoint. Brian and Cecilia were bound with clothesline. And, just as they thought the ordeal was about to end, the Zodiac Killer set upon them with a foot-long knife. When the savage attack was over, the stranger simply walked away and left his victims in agony. To prove he was responsible for this gory act, he inscribed the Zodiac symbol on the car and once again reported his crime and its location to the police. Cecilia Shepard was conscious when the cops arrived and gave a detailed description of the attacker. Shepard lapsed into a coma during transport to the hospital and never regained consciousness. She died 2 days later. But Hartnell survived to recount his tale to the press. The Zodiac's next and last confirmed kill was a cab driver. On October 11, 1969, Paul Stein met his maker.
He killed a taxi cab driver, and it very well may be that the only reason that taxi driver was killed was just so he would have another opportunity to taunt the police. He paused after killing this person to rip a piece of their shirt off, simply so he would be able to send it into the police and have a way of identifying, yes, I really am the killer of these people.
Zodiac would continue to taunt police and manipulate the press for years. A 340-symbol cipher mailed November 8, 1969, remains unsolved, but there were no more confirmed killings. Although many were suspected before and after the 5 he killed and the 2 he wounded, the Zodiac would never be identified. He would become the most famous never-captured serial killer after Jack the Ripper, and perhaps is still alive today. And, as with Jack the Ripper, speculation to his identity and conspiracy theories have abounded throughout the decades.
The latest film on the Zodiac Killer was well done. I got a chance to analyze it and speak at a theater here at the university after it was shown by a film group. I don't think they're ever going to solve it. I think it's just one of those cases that they're never going to solve. Now, on the other hand, they didn't think the Green River Killer case would be solved, and of course, Gary Ridgway is now in prison. So who knows? Maybe with the cold case squads and the DNA and other things to come down the pike in forensics, we'll find out who the man was, or the woman was, or whoever they were, for that matter.
Such was not the case for another serial killer with the same signature as the Zodiac. The man who terrorized a city clear across the country. That place was New York, the center of world commerce. The Big Apple. It was the summer of 1977, and disco was king. The Yankees were in a pennant race. But the great city of New York was on edge. A 2-day blackout in July had led to rioting and looting. The economy was spiraling downward. But New Yorkers could deal with that kind of discomfort. What sent them into a nail-biting panic, what had them gasping in fear, was a heartless, ghostly killer on the loose. The infamous Son of Sam. His capture would reveal a new psychology of serial killers like the Zodiac Killer. Unlike Jack the Ripper or Ed Gein, there was no sexual pleasure in the way he killed. There was nothing personal. He was a serial killer who killed for the sake of killing. His name was David Berkowitz, and New York had no idea what laid in store for them.
Berkowitz, the .44 caliber killer, or whatever he's referred to, he's also referred to Son of Sam because of the dog that he supposedly heard from that told him to commit these acts, which he claimed at one time. I think killed because he enjoyed it. I think he's just one of those people that was enraged and probably had some trauma in his background that was primed to go out and start shooting people. He may have been lonely. There are a number of explanations you can give because there's not a whole lot of detail known about Berkowitz prior to the killings. But as to what makes him tick, I think it's, I don't know, I think it's trauma, and the trauma that caused the rage that finally broke out into what he considered his fantasies, which was shooting people, shooting couples with a weapon, a .44 caliber revolver.
Most serial killers are up close and personal with their victims. They use their hands. They strangle, they stab, they mutilate, and that's what makes them feel good. It's the control that they have over the pain and suffering of their poor victims. But Son of Sam was different. David Berkowitz used a firearm to kill his 6 victims, so he actually distanced himself from them. And it's that fact alone that makes you wonder what his motive was.
The Son of Sam was born Richard David Falco in Brooklyn, New York in 1953. The adopted son of Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, he was an odd and aloof child. He delighted in setting fires. Berkowitz joined the U.S. Air Force and served from 1971 to 1974. As he matured, a dark and compulsive need to kill took over his body, a need he could not suppress for very long. His reign of terror lasted from July 1976 to July 1977. He shot unsuspecting victims from point-blank range, killing 6 and wounding 7. During this time, the New York Police Department erupted with eyewitness accounts of a mysterious and elusive assailant. Terror engulfed the city. Berkowitz especially loved young, attractive women with long brunette hair, and many frightened girls dyed their hair blonde. And like the Zodiac Killer, he didn't care if his killings were public.
One of the things I've noticed is that in some cases involving both multiple murder and serial murder, the perpetrator kills people in the dark, so to speak, perhaps literally in the dark, but sometimes more figuratively, in the sense that the perpetrator doesn't want to be found, wants to go undetected. And then you find serial murderers, such as Berkowitz, son of Sam, who kill people in public places where any rational person would conclude, I'm going to be discovered, I'm going to be found out. And it's, I think, useful to distinguish among these cases where the perpetrator apparently is not overly concerned about being detected.
He also enjoyed sending letters around the city, taunting police. Dear Captain Joseph Borelli, I am deeply hurt by your calling me a women hater. I am not, but I am a monster. I am the son of Sam. I'm a little brat. Police, let me haunt you with these words. I'll be back. I'll be back. To be interpreted as bang, bang, bang. Ugh. Yours in murder, Mr. Monster.
It's a really fascinating element to it because you can tell that there was additional excitement for the killer associated with the public attention. That the killing obviously created excitement in their mind and the desire to repeat, but that the attention that it was getting, the public outcry, it's almost an additional form of sadism. It's continuing the sadism because now you're horrifying the public. You're not just victimizing this one individual, but you're also horrifying everyone else and getting everyone else excited. And it obviously played into this person's fantasy.
However, the fantasy would not last long. Police were able to track a parking ticket issued to a car parked near the son of Sam's latest victims. The car belonged to a David Berkowitz. In early August 1977, the police arrested Berkowitz outside his Yonkers apartment. The son of Sam's year of bloodlust was finally over. New Yorkers could finally go out again. Berkowitz is remembered by his joyful smile as police brought him into the station. A true sign of a psychopath.
One has to wonder whether those who commit their murders in the public eye, so to speak, in full view of witnesses, are people who crave attention in some instances, people who want to be caught in some instances, people who may want to be punished in some instances. And so they're not interested in the cat and mouse game. They almost have this deep-seated wish to be known, to end up on the news. They may crave the publicity, and in some instances may want to be caught because they know they're spinning out of control, and in this rather twisted way set up circumstances where they will be caught and taken out of commission.
Overtly paranoid and deranged, Berkowitz confessed to everything.
Initially, David Berkowitz, son of Sam, was seen by mental health professionals, including psychiatrists, as certifiably insane. You know, he talked to dogs, he hallucinated. Well, it turned out that he was malingering, that he actually wasn't the least bit out of touch with reality, that he knew exactly what he was doing, and he did the wrong thing because that's what he wanted to do, and he didn't have what it took to stop him. That is, he was a sociopath who didn't have the conscience, the superego, to prevent him from killing. But it took a long time before he was seen for what he really was. And even to this day, having been incarcerated for decades, he now claims to have found religion. Well, maybe he has and maybe he hasn't, but I can tell you that sociopaths really don't change. We don't know how to treat them. We don't know how to rehabilitate them. Chances are he is just thinking of manipulating the system by making himself out to be a transformed, good person.
Berkowitz and the Zodiac Killer are surely two birds of a feather. And thanks to Berkowitz's capture, their dark world was illuminated. A world where killing itself fills a psychological desire. Indeed, these men's souls are empty. Berkowitz summed it up perfectly when he said, "I didn't want to hurt them. I only wanted to kill them." Such fabrications were also spouted by another man who was just a cold-blooded killer. Theodore Robert Bundy, also known as Ted Bundy, was perhaps the most contradictory serial killer who ever lived.
Like I'm some sort of weirdo, because I'm not.
A serial killer who broke the mold in many ways. A man who is estimated to have killed anywhere from 30 to 100 women. A brutal serial killer that told everyone he was a rapist who had to kill in order to stay free. In an interview, he said,
And so he would say, well, this person really isn't interested in killing. Killing isn't the point. Violence isn't the point. What he's interested in is the rape, and the rape is the point. But then you have this messy, situation to deal with where you have this victim who could, report you, or you could get in trouble. So therefore, the killing is necessary simply to perpetuate the ability to perform these rapes. And yet, when he describes, they say, well, how would this person have started out? He's like, well, perhaps as a peeping Tom. And then his first experience would be he sees a woman walking alone down an alley. So he comes up behind her and he clocks her in the back of the head with this piece of wood that he found. Gosh, that doesn't sound like rape to me. That sounds like violence to me. It was very obvious that for him, the violence and the sexual acts that he committed were certainly both giving him satisfaction that he desired, even up to the final acts that he performed down in that sorority house in Florida. Those were acts of violence. He didn't have the opportunity to rape those women. The only thing that really characterizes that crime as sexual at all is that he specifically chose attractive, young female victims. So there was obviously the sexual component to it, but he wasn't having sex with those women. He was murdering them.
Mysteriously, Ted Bundy appeared to be anything but a serial killer. He was a Boy Scout, a prominent member of the Republican Party in the state of Washington. He even volunteered at Seattle, Washington's suicide hotline.
Ted Bundy, who killed dozens of women across the country, also worked on a suicide hotline in Seattle. He also saved the life of a 4-year-old drowning boy. And whether he was taking lives or saving lives, he was feeling powerful. And that's a very important motive among serial killers.
Adding to his mystique, Bundy was a brilliant student admired by his college professors.
I think one of the most interesting things about Ted Bundy is the image that people have of him. He is seen as some kind of misguided genius. Really not such a bad guy. I mean, after all, he only killed dozens of women across the country, in Washington and Utah and Colorado and Michigan and Florida. And by the way, he was also a rapist. His last victim was a 12-year-old girl in Florida, Kimberly Leach. He murdered her by shoving her face in the mud until she suffocated. I don't see him as a misguided anything. I see him as a monster.
As a serial killer, Bundy had a number of factors working in his favor. He was an ordinary, good-looking guy. a guy who used all the glad-handing skills he learned during his days of associating with politicians.
I think there's a myth that is propagated because Ted Bundy was a charming, handsome guy. It was easy for him to lure his victims. He didn't look like the monster that he was. He was extraordinarily ordinary in his appearance. He looked like the last person you'd suspect, not the first. And that, I think, colored the image that we have of serial killers ever since the 1970s.
It is the myth of the evil serial killer genius. The serial killer genius brilliantly portrayed by Anthony Hopkins in the 1991 movie The Silence of the Lambs. But with Ted Bundy, what appeared to be genius may have been dumb luck more than anything else.
One of the things about Ted Bundy that I think sets him apart, besides the sheer number of women that he killed, was his chutzpah. This was a guy who was very brash in many of the things that he did, and committed crimes that were that took a great deal of risk to perform. In one case, he went to a very popular recreation area, Lake Sammamish, and wore a fake cast on his arm and elicited the help of two different young women to help get a boat onto or off of his automobile, and then actually got them to accompany him to another location where twice in the same day he raped and murdered these two women in the same location. They were both kidnapped from a very public place. Numerous people saw him that day, were able to provide descriptions of him that day, were able to provide a description of his automobile, and yet he wasn't apprehended after that.
Bundy was born in Burlington, Vermont, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers. The identity of his father was never known, though relatives were suspicious about his grandfather, who was abusive and violent to his mother, Louise. Raised with his grandparents, he believed his mother was really his sister. Indeed, the truth about Bundy's young mom was hidden for the next 20 years. In 1950, Louise and Ted moved to Tacoma, Washington, where she married Johnny Culpepper Bundy. Throughout his childhood and into college, Bundy remained shy and never fit in socially. While attending the University of Washington, he met a vivacious young co-ed, Stephanie Brooks, who later dumped him because of his immaturity and lack of ambition. But Bundy wasn't through with her. In fact, in a macabre fashion, he would never be through with her. In 1968, Bundy changed. He became more ambitious. A man who wanted to be in charge. He rekindled his relationship with Stephanie. Then, just after New Year's 1974, he abruptly broke it off. A few days later, he began his violent attacks against women. Once Bundy began killing, he became an insatiable murderer. His signature was his brutality. All his victims, except the last, were killed by a savage blow to the head. At the same time, all his victims looked like his ex-girlfriend.
Ted Bundy, he chose his victims, I think, because of appearance of his girlfriend. If you look at photographs of his victims, all of them have the long dark hair, and usually it's parted down the middle, and there's a very similar appearance to each one of them, which is a very similar appearance to his girlfriend.
Bundy's first known murder victim was a 21-year-old college student, Linda Ann Healy. Bundy snuck into her apartment, knocked her unconscious, wrapped her in a sheet, and carried her out of the apartment. Her skull was found a year later. Now, Bundy's frenzy for rape and murder dominated him completely. For the next year and a half, Bundy murdered at least 27 women as he traveled through Oregon, Colorado, and Utah on a brutal killing spree. Police in each state reported female victims, all young and attractive. He was finally captured in Granger, Utah, after a botched kidnapping. Bundy was sentenced to 15 years. But escaping from jail, he made it to Florida, where he killed at least 3 more times before he was caught and sentenced to death in Florida's electric chair, Old Sparky. On January 24, 1989, the so-called genius of death was himself finally dead. Besides his charming manner and ordinary good looks, one of the main reasons Bundy eluded law enforcement was that he was the first to move out of a local comfort zone. All other serial killers up to this point, from Jack the Ripper to Ed Gein to the Boston Strangler to the Zodiac Killer to the Son of Sam, did their killing in basically a single jurisdictional area. In short, they did not move over great distances. Bundy broke the mold.
Ted was different at the time. He did cover a lot of space in a relatively short period of time, which was kind of unknown at that time. Now it's much more common. We see killers moving at greater distances from their homes or from their point of operation, if you will, to commit a crime because they don't want to be seen in their own area. Some killers, granted, like a comfort zone, they're familiar with the area. But as I said, we're seeing more and more that will go longer distances.
How and why serial killers murdered were becoming ever more a mystery. And therefore, they were increasingly difficult to catch.